Japan continued to have a bad time of it as in mid-March, the Aum Shinrikyo cult released sarin nerve gas into the Tokyo underground, specifically targeting two lines that passed through stations used by the National Diet. The group responsible believed that a civilization-ending global war between the US and Japan was inevitable, and that only cult members, and those killed by the cult, would escape eternal damnation as a result. The group had already conducted a number of attacks in Japan, and indeed the cult leader Shoko Asahara had found out about a police raid scheduled for the 22nd of March, so the Tokyo subway attack on the 20th of March was intended to disrupt that, and if it kicked off the hoped-for apocalypse as well, then so much the better. Over 6,000 people were injured in what remains Japan's worst domestic terror attack, with 13 killed outright and another, Sachiko Asakawa, who died in 2020 of what were determined to be long-term effects of the gas. The Queen was on tour, travelling first to Northern Ireland for the first time since the 1994 ceasefire, and then making a symbolic visit to South Africa, the first in nearly 50 years since the imposition of the apartheid system. With the first free elections and abolition of apartheid in 1994, the royal visit was part of the general reintegration of South Africa into the wider world. On the 23rd of March, French footballer Eric Cantona appeared in Croydon Crown Court for assault after an incident in a game for Manchester United against Crystal Palace in January. Cantona had been sent off for kicking out at Palace defender Richard Shaw, and as he made his way off, a Crystal Palace supporter shouted something at him that I shan't repeat here. Cantona responded in the calm, reasoned manner for which he was well known.
He launched himself 6 feet into the crowd and kung fu kicked a supporter who was, without a shadow of a doubt, giving him lip, without a shadow of a doubt giving him stick.
Asked about the incident at a press conference, Cantona generated another famous video clip as he refused to answer any questions.
When the seagulls follow the trawler, it's because they think sardines will be thrown into the sea. Thank you very much.
He admitted the charges and was sentenced to 14 days in prison, but was allowed out on appeal, which would be heard a week later, just after the Brazilian Grand Prix. The sentence was commuted to 120 hours of community service, but more severe penalties were imposed by the footballing authorities. Manchester United fined him £20,000 and dropped him for the remainder of the season, with the FA adding another £10,000 fine and banning him for 8 months, which would therefore also include the summer, with FIFA extending the ban worldwide, meaning Cantona couldn't just go play for somebody else, and France coach M. Jacquet stripped him of the captaincy of the national team, for whom he would never play again. France were engaged in trying to qualify for Euro 96, which would be their first tournament in a decade, and had only scored twice in their first 5 games, so it was no small sacrifice for them to make. And on the day of the Brazilian Grand Prix, the Schengen Agreement went into force, essentially removing barriers to travel within the European Union, 10 years after the initial agreement was signed in the small town of Schengen in Luxembourg, symbolically on the point where Luxembourg meets Germany and France. These Schengen treaties originally operated independently of the EU, which allowed for individual nations to join or leave the area. The UK and Ireland had already done so, with the issue of their mutual border on the island of Ireland still somewhat live, while Switzerland and Norway, both non-EU members but entirely surrounded by them, except in Norway's case for a tiny border with Russia, were watching with interest to see if they wanted to join too. From now onwards it would be possible to drive, or take the train, from Lisbon to Vienna or Athens to Stockholm without stopping to show your passport at any stage. The F1 circus reconvened in Sao Paulo for the first Grand Prix of the year, and it was difficult to escape the shadow of the city's most famous son. Many of those in the paddock made private pilgrimages to the grave of Ayrton Senna, including Alain Prost, who managed to give the press pack the slip before meeting with Senna's father Milton da Silva. He was also there to attend the official launch of the Senna Foundation, led by Ayrton's sister Viviane. In the years before his death, Ayrton had become more engaged in charity work, particularly with children, and at the foundation's launch, Viviane made it known that he had been making secret donations to children's charities, and she was now making that public in the hope of inspiring others to do the same. The hero worship of Senna had its downsides too, of course, with thousands changing hands for knock-off merchandise, and the pressure on Rubens Barrichello at the first race of the year was intense. After every sponsor engagement for Pepsi or Marlboro or Peugeot, he was mobbed by fans hailing him as the new Senna, heir to their hero, and he had to be hustled out by his security. It wasn't exactly the kind of thing to focus the mind on a new season of racing. Rubens was now the leader of a clutch of Brazilian drivers, including Christian Fittipaldi, racing a Reynard for Walker Racing in IndyCar this year as Robbie Gordon's teammate, but here in Sao Paulo for the commemorations, the 40 pairing of Pedro Diniz and Roberto Moreno, and they were also to have been joined by Paolo Karaski, who'd made a single F3000 outing with Nordic Racing last year and had made Pacific an offer for the South American races, but either the offer wasn't enough or he couldn't get a super licence in time. In any case, so Gasho would be driving after all. In any case, Rubens had decided to mark the occasion by commissioning a one-off helmet design, replacing the red panels with Senna's iconic yellow, green and blue, shaded as if recessed behind the white. As far as I can tell, this is the first time a Formula One driver has had a special helmet design made for a single race. There were wrangles behind the scenes too, as the season began with a classic of the genre, a spat over the new super licence terms, and the threat of a driver's strike. The points at issue this time around were Max Mosley's insertion of a non-liability clause in the case of accidents, and a ban on media exclusivity agreements, this latter in the wake of Michael Schumacher signing a deal to give exclusive interviews to RTL, about which Bernie Ecclestone in particular was deeply annoyed. In the end, 6 drivers refused to sign, which would mean they would be unable to compete: Gerhard Berger, Michael Schumacher, Nigel Mansell, Damon Hill, Jean Alesi and Martin Brundle, all senior figures in the sport. Faced with having to start the season with neither of the 2 championship contenders and neither of the 2 Ferrari drivers, Mosley and Ecclestone backed down and the race could go ahead. Of those 6 drivers, not all were due to actually be racing anyway. Martin Brundle was sitting out the first 3 races while Aguri Suzuki drove his Ligier and had instead agreed to drive a microphone for the BBC, on co-commentating duties with Murray Walker, while McLaren had surprised many with their slightly sheepish announcement that Nigel Mansell would miss at least the South American legs as a new chassis was being built to suit his needs. This was widely reported as Mansell being too fat to fit in the MP410, a jab at his advancing years in F1 terms, but actually even the rather more svelte Mika Hakkinen had said it was a bit of a squeeze in there, and Mansell just simply had a bulkier, wider frame. He could physically fit in the car, but testing had made it obvious that he couldn't do a full race distance in it thanks to pain from his elbows and hips. So while a new wider cockpit was designed, fabricated and tested at Woking, hopefully in time for the start of the European season, Ron Dennis considered his test driver Jan Magnussen, but perhaps with an eye on Jos Verstappen's lively debut last year, instead entrusted the car to former McLaren tester Mark Blundell, out of a drive after being unable to finance the continuation of his Tyrrell contract. Car 7, Mark Blundell. Poor Mark has never had the breaks in F1. 3 times now he's signed for a team, Brabham in 91, Ligier in 93 and Tyrrell in 94, and done well, only to find himself dropped at the end of the season in favour of more politically acceptable or better funded alternatives. The opportunity to race with a top team, even for 2 races, was certainly unexpected, even if he was McLaren's test driver for 1992, and Blundell will want to take the opportunity of having a top drive to show what everyone is missing out on, and maybe get himself in the frame as others start to run out of funds as the year goes on. The cars set off for their first laps of a newly resurfaced Interlagos on Thursday and got a bit of a surprise, as it was even bumpier than it had been before it was resurfaced. Rubens Barrichello led the criticism, pointing out that it was no good just dumping more asphalt on the bumps. You need to actually break up the underlying surface and put a new one down. But there was nothing much that could be done at that stage apart from hold on tight and try and keep it on the track, although Mansell certainly might consider himself well off out of it. It rained overnight on Thursday and Friday, so both Friday and Saturday qualifying successions were held in damp but drying conditions, which didn't help either with grip on the track or with traffic, as teams waited as long as they could before sending out their cars. Damon Hill set the fastest time on Friday, with Berger second and Coulthard overcoming both tonsillitis and understeer to go third, with Schumacher back in 6th after a terrifying spin into the barriers at 140 miles an hour, 230 kph, which resulted in the team not sending Herbert out at all while they figured out what was wrong. Eventually, the problem was traced to a joint in the steering column, new parts were sourced locally, and the team were happy enough to go again on Saturday. Schumacher certainly didn't seem any the worse for wear, as he was fastest on Saturday, but still couldn't quite beat Hill's Friday time. Damon one of just 3 drivers to post their best times in the first session. And so Hill would start on pole, with Schumacher alongside, with their respective teammates Coulthard and Herbert behind on row 2, a great result for Renault, followed by the Ferraris of Berger and Alesi on row 3. The McLaren-Mercedes partnership would begin in 7th and 9th, both drivers complaining of a lack of balance in the chassis. They bracketed Eddie Irvine using their old engine, but whether it was the pressure or just bad luck, Rubinho had an engine failure on Friday and an off on Saturday and would have to make do with 16th. Panis in the new Ligier Mugen was 10th, followed by the two Tyrrells, but the Sauber Fords were a disappointment, with Frentzen finding the car unstable on the poor surface and Wendlinger finding the same, but with added rustiness, having not raced in nearly a year. The footwork looked reasonably good in the hands of Morbidelli, 13th, while Inoue was 21st after making some rookie errors on an unfamiliar track. He was outqualified by Bertrand Gachot, 20th, and it looked like Pacific had made progress. Not only had both cars qualified with relative ease, they had beaten both the Simtex and the new 40s in the process. With no LaRousses present, everyone was guaranteed a qualifying spot, which was a particular source of relief for Mimo Schiattarella, who demolished a Simtech on Friday and ended Saturday just over 8 seconds off the pace, and 3/10 behind debutant Pedro Diniz, who had a new coach too, one René Arnoux, revisiting here the site of his first win at the old Interlagos layout in 1980 for the Renault team. Sunday dawned grey and gloomy again, though the forecasters said it should stay dry, and despite all the Senna hoopla, there were only 60,000 in the stands, while TV Globo would report post-race that it had lost 10% of its viewership compared to 1994. The morning warm-up saw Coulthard fastest, while both Herbert and Katayama had car trouble and would start in their respective spares. But then, just half an hour before the race was due to start, there was panic, as Elf's chief chemist Valerie Joquera was told that Charlie Whiting's technical team had found samples of fuel from Coulthard's Williams and Schumacher's Benetton were non-compliant. 20 minutes later, as the drivers were strapping on their helmets ready to go, the stewards announced that the Williams and Benetton teams had been fined $30,000 each, and that the result of the race would be provisional until a fuller investigation could occur. Bedlam behind the scenes as Renault and Elf technicians alike split their time between arguing with officials and actually getting ready for the race, and presumably both Hill and Herbert were also in the firing line, as the teams were hardly putting different fuel in each car. The drivers were not informed of all of this, so as to keep their minds on the job, but between this and the super licence drama, any hope the FIA had of 1995 being a nice, smooth, controversy-free season seemed to have evaporated already. By the time the 30-second board went up, there was blue sky peeking through the clouds, but while 26 cars set off for the parade lap, only 25 made it back around, because Pierluigi Martini's Minardi gearbox gave up on the second corner. The rest lined up to start the 1995 season, and off they went, with Schumacher getting a great start to go alongside Hill, and then take the lead as they went into the Senna S, with Coulthard holding on to third, but Herbert dropping back, while Hakkinen got a flying start to pass both Ferraris and tuck in behind Coulthard, and Panis was punted off by Sarlo in an unseen incident in the S's. As the cars bounced their way around lap 2, Hill was hanging onto the back of Schumacher, while Hakkinen was dropping back a little from Coulthard, the gap 2.3 seconds by lap 3, but still staying easily ahead of the Ferraris, while Herbert was back in 7th. Hill had a look at Subida do Lago on lap 4 and nearly lost second to Coulthard when he backed out of the move. Meanwhile, Barrichello was dropping back, losing 12th to Suzuki, and Herbert was likewise having trouble with the spare Benetton which was set up for Schumacher, and a mistake let Irvine and the Tyrrells all pile through, dropping him to 10th. Suzuki was motoring, meanwhile, taking 11th off Frentzen and was now shaping up to pass Herbert too, while up front Schumacher and Hill, though still running close together, had left Coulthard behind, and were trading fastest laps as the top 6 started stringing out a bit, with a big gap from Coulthard back to Hakkinen and another from him back to the Ferrari twins, who were running close together, while Irvine approached with Sarlo in tow. On lap 10 the two leaders were already lapping Diniz, who kept well out of the way as the pair came through going into the Senna S. Just ahead were Moreno and Schiattarella having their own little battle, while Frentzen's electrics gave up, retirement number 3, and then Schiattarella parked his Simtech up a lap later with steering and brake trouble, having not long passed Moreno to take what was now 21st place. With 3 separate duels, Schumacher-Hill, Berger-Alesi and Irvine-Sarlo in the top 7 places, thought started to turn to pit strategy, as there was activity in the Benetton pit on lap 14 of 71, about 1/5 distance, so still a bit early unless anyone was planning to do 4 stops. It looked briefly like Irvine was going to do just that, but he was in fact coming in to retire with a broken O-ring on his gearbox, and just as that was happening, Katayama, who'd been keeping an eye on Eddie's duel with Sarlo, spun out at Subida do Lago, stalled, and was out too, bringing out the yellow flags as course cars appeared to get the Tyrrell off the track. On lap 17, Alesi was the actual first to refuel, a 9.9 second stop getting him back out 11th, and as he was leaving the pits, Barrichello was rolling down the entrance lane, his gearbox having likewise given up the ghost, only for Schumacher to pass him on the way in, as the leader came in for the first of presumably 3 stops. A quick one got him back out 5th, just behind Berger, though he didn't stay there for long, taking 4th at the end of the start-finish straight. So Hill was leading Coulthard now by about 7 seconds on lap 20, with Häkkinen a rather distant third, 21 seconds behind the leader. Herbert was next in from 8th, but the unfortunate Englishman stalled and was stationary for 16 seconds and left the pits even further behind. Next in was Hill, a 2-stop strategy, so a longer stop, 11 seconds, but he was helped by Luca Badoer in the Minardi, who held Schumacher up long enough for Hill to get out ahead, and just behind Häkkinen, who would presumably be pitting himself soon. Not willing to wait, Hill got past quickly enough, and Schumacher was behind too, but the McLaren pulled in before he needed to overtake. A problem with the fuel hose held Mika up, and he was stationary for 22 seconds, emerging 7th between Salo and Suzuki. Gasho was the latest victim of a dud gearbox, and next time round Berger was in to be the latest victim of a problematic stop, as his team didn't get the nut on his right wheel and had to go get another, the Austrian emerging 7th. Häkkinen was now on the tail of Berger's teammate Alesi, and when the Ferrari was briefly held up by Montemini, he pounced to take 5th place and set off in pursuit of his old buddy Mika Salo, who'd passed Alesi on the track a couple of laps earlier. Meanwhile, up front, Hill had lost second gear, which didn't bode well, and had allowed Schumacher to close up, but before the two could resume their tussle, Hill's left rear suspension gave way on the exit of the Senna S and spun him into retirement. So that put Schumacher in a comfortable lead of some 14 seconds over Coulthard, with Salo up to a dizzying 3rd in just his 3rd F1 race. A lap later, Herbert joined his countryman in more or less the same spot, punted out by Suzuki in another off-camera incident, and while the Ligier came in for a new wing, the Ferraris had joined battle again, back in 5th and 6th places like in the early stages, but now the other way round, as Berger hopped around behind Alesi looking for an opening. Schumacher made his second stop of 3 on lap 36, pretty much bang on half distance, which left Coulthard in the lead and elevated Salo to 2nd, but Häkkinen was closing rapidly, as Salo was suffering cramps in his hand and was driving one-handed. The anticipated resumption of the duelling Mikas of British F3 from 1990 would have to wait, though, as the Tyrrell hit a bump and spun, Salo keeping the engine running but letting the McLaren and 2 Ferraris past before he got going again, and then came in next time around for his fuel stop and to replace his flat-spotted tyres. Schumacher, meanwhile, was 11 seconds behind Coulthard and was charging, and both drivers were having traffic troubles. Salo had emerged right in the path of Schumacher, while Mark Blundell didn't seem willing to let Coulthard put a lap on him. Schumacher was gaining, but not quickly. Inouye had a spin at turn 1 and got a shove from the marshals to get going, coming in at the end of the lap to have his car checked over before setting off again, as Häkkinen made his second stop, another problem getting the fuel nozzle off, and he rejoined behind the Ferraris, just ahead of leader David Coulthard and in the middle of a great knot of traffic. Alesi was next in for his second stop, and Moreno made his first off-camera, and in the meantime Schumacher had closed the gap to Coulthard to just over 5 seconds. The Scot was having tyre trouble and locked up a couple of times, but now Schumacher was coming through the same big group of traffic and was also being held up, though not as much as Coulthard had been. On lap 47, Wendlinger's battery gave out just as he was coming into the pits, and just like Barrichello earlier, the leader went past as he came in for a pit stop, in this case Coulthard making his second, a 10.8 second stop, which put him back out second, 22 seconds behind Schumacher. That wouldn't be enough to allow Schumacher to stop and still retain the lead, and the German put his foot down to try and make it bigger, with 5 or 6 laps to make a big enough gap for his third and final stop. Berger, the last man unlapped, came in third and left, still third, but now having been lapped, as Schumacher got the hammer down and lapped faster and faster, eking out a lead from Coulthard, but still only a little at a time. Moreno spun out from 11th 3 laps down, just as Schumacher blew past. Finally, the Benetton peeled in on lap 53 of 72, with a 26-second lead. A slick 7.4 second stop and a series of fast laps had put him back out on the track ahead of Coulthard to the tune of 4 seconds, and David had Alesi right ahead of him, lapping a couple of seconds a lap slower. He got past soon enough, but by then Schumacher was nearly 5 seconds up the road, and with everyone now having stopped, Berger was third, Häkkinen fourth, despite missing a chunk of rear wing, Alesi fifth, and Morbidelli, Sixth, then Salo, Blundell, Suzuki, Montemini, Dinish and Inoue the remaining runners, the latter three 5, 6 and 9 laps down respectively. The Japanese driver didn't go any further though, a ruptured fuel line causing a lively fire, a swift exit from the cockpit and a cloud of extinguisher, all of which saved the stewards the bother of disqualifying him for his push start earlier, while his teammate Morbidelli was still 6th and now reeling in a lazy and gunning for 5th place, until his fuel system stopped delivering any fuel and he rolled in to retire just 7 laps before the end, his luck not improving much from last year. That promoted Blundell to 6th and a point, as Schumacher continued to cruise 8 seconds ahead of Coulthard and apparently comfortable in the lead, as the Williams was now stuck behind Berger. By the time David got through, it was too late, and Schumacher came home the winner by just over 11 seconds, and those two were the only ones on the leading lap. And of course, were also the two who were racing under suspicion of fuel irregularities, which could mean that in the end Berger, a lap down in 3rd place, would be declared the winner after all. Hakkinen, Alesi and Blundell made up the other point-paying places, with Salo and Suzuki 7th and 8th, and hoping the top two would be disqualified. Montemini brought home his Pacific for the team's first ever finish in 9th place, with Dinish a very distant 10th, but happy enough to have completed the full race distance and be the sole Brazilian to see the checkered flag at Interlagos. But that evening, FIA spokesman Martin Whittaker announced that Schumacher and Coulthard had both been disqualified from the race, with Berger, the new winner, Hakkinen 2nd and Alesi 3rd. Usually a few days were taken to investigate, but apparently Bernie Eccleston was keen to get it done quickly, and so that day it was. Ferrari, understandably, uncorked the champagne, which the Williams and Benetton mechanics equally understandably took umbrage at, and needless to say both Frank and Flavio, as well as Renault, launched immediate appeals, while Elf promised to launch their own investigation and mobilise the legal team. With the honour of France apparently at stake, Max Mosley received a barrage of calls at FIA headquarters in Paris, and armies of lawyers were swinging into action. At the heart of Elf's defence were two things. Firstly, that the FIA mobile lab was by its very nature less reliable than a proper facility, and the fuel should be tested again before a final decision was made. That claim was backed up by some AGIP engineers, which wouldn't please Ferrari. And secondly, that given how much scrutiny everything was under this year, Elf would have to be really stupid to try cheating with 2 of the 14 cars that they supplied, and 2 of the most high profile at that. With the so-called Elf affair still rumbling, teams packed up and headed for Argentina for the next race in 2 weeks' time, while many of the drivers hit the beach for a spot of R&R, hoping to relax after the rigours of the bumpy Interlagos circuit, and hoping the newly rebuilt Circuit Oscar Galvez in Buenos Aires would be a bit smoother.